the man who quietly stepped out of the 20th century. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. Most people imagine escape as something loud, a slammed door, a raised voice, a dramatic goodbye. But the most dangerous kind of departure makes no sound at all. This is not a story about running away. It is a story about stepping aside. About a man who looked at the 20th century, its speed, its systems, its promises, and decided very calmly that it was not built for the kind of life he wanted to live. He did not announce this choice. He did not try to convince anyone. He simply stopped participating. This is the story of what happens when a man chooses independence over belonging and time over convenience. Sylvan Hart did not disappear in the way legends usually do. There was no crisis that forced him out. No single betrayal, no sudden loss. Instead, there was accumulation. Small observations stacking quietly on top of one another until a conclusion became unavoidable. He was educated, well-read, fluent in languages most people never attempt, comfortable discussing history, philosophy, science. By all reasonable measures, Sylvan Hart should have succeeded within the system. But the year was 1932. Factories were closing without warning. Banks were failing overnight. Men who had done everything correctly, worked hard, saved carefully, trusted authority, were standing in lines, holding lunch pails they no longer needed. Hart noticed something most people tried not to. These men were not lazy. They were not foolish. They were dependent. Their food came from stores, their clothes from factories, their shelter from loans, their survival from systems they did not control and did not understand. And when those systems faltered, everything else collapsed with them. This realization did not arrive as anger. It arrived as clarity. Hart understood that modern life had traded something essential for comfort, not evil for good, not oppression for freedom, but skill for convenience, competence for efficiency. He saw that most people no longer knew how to provide for themselves at the most basic level. They had outsourced survival itself. And in a functioning society, that trade felt harmless, even wise. But Hart had watched it fail, so he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not organize his existence around systems that could disappear. He would not place his survival in the hands of strangers. He would not spend his years working only to remain dependent. This was not rebellion. It was withdrawal, not from people, from reliance. The choice was quiet, almost invisible. He did not reject society with speeches or slogans. He simply chose a different metric of wealth. Not money, but ability. Not security, promised by institutions, but security earned through skill. And so, without ceremony, Sylvan Hart began stepping out of the 20th century, not backward into the past, but inward, toward something slower, harder, and far more deliberate. A life where every object had a history. Every meal had memory. Every comfort had cost. This story does not begin with heroism. It begins with attention. With a man who noticed how fragile modern life actually was and decided quietly not to build his future on that fragility. As you rest now, breathing steadily, let the noise of the modern world soften. Lights dim, schedules loosen, urgency dissolves. Somewhere beyond roads and clocks, a canyon waits, and a man, carrying little more than intention, walks toward it. The century does not notice him leaving, but everything that follows will. Chapter 1: Hell's Canyon, where leaving is harder than staying. If independence was Hart's idea, Hell's Canyon was the place capable of testing whether that idea could survive reality. Leaving society is easy in theory. You quit a job. You stop answering messages. You move somewhere quieter. What Hart chose instead was not quiet. It was removal. Hell's Canyon does not sit politely on a map. It cuts downward, deeper than the Grand Canyon. So steep that sunlight arrives late and leaves early, as if unsure it belongs there. The Salmon River runs through its center, narrow and violent, folding back on itself, crashing against stone that has learned patience over millions of years. Early explorers took one look and turned around. They called it the River of No Return, not as poetry, but as warning. This was not wilderness designed for visitors. There were no trails waiting to be followed, no safety nets disguised as adventure. If you entered this place, you accepted a simple truth. Getting out would require more effort than most lives ever demand. For Hart, that was the point. He was not looking for beauty. He was looking for finality, a place so inaccessible that convenience could not follow him, so unforgiving that shortcuts would fail immediately, so isolated that dependence would become obvious within weeks. Hell's Canyon does not allow improvisation. It does not forgive optimism. It does not reward courage. It rewards preparation and punishes the lack of it without drama. Summer here is not gentle. Heat gathers between stone walls and refuses to escape. Temperatures rise past comfort, past tolerance, into something closer to pressure. Winter is worse. Cold air sinks into the canyon and stays there, trapped like water in a basin. 40 below is not an anomaly. It is a recurring condition. Firewood is not optional. Food storage is not theoretical. Mistakes are not lessons. They are consequences. Hart arrived knowing this intellectually. But knowing something and living inside it are different experiences. The canyon did not care that he was educated. It did not care that he had read books about survival. It did not care about intention. The land asked one question, repeated daily in different forms. What can you actually do with your hands? Everything else was irrelevant. This is where the fantasy of independence usually collapses. Not in dramatic moments, but in repetition. Cold mornings that never soften. Tasks that must be done regardless of mood. Systems that demand maintenance without praise. There is no applause in Hell's Canyon. No feedback loop. No sense of progress unless you define it yourself. And that is why Hart chose it. Modern life cushions, failure. It delays consequences. It allows dependence to feel invisible. The canyon does not. Here, every weakness is exposed gently but completely. If your shelter leaks, you know immediately. If your food runs short, hunger arrives on schedule. If your tools fail, your day stops. Hart was not seeking punishment. He was seeking honesty, a place where cause and effect were close enough to touch, where effort mattered more than explanation. As you settle deeper now, breathing slow and steady, imagine standing at the river's edge, the sound constant, uninterested in you. Above, the canyon walls rise like time itself, indifferent, immovable, patient. This is not a backdrop for adventure. It is a filter. Most people would pass through briefly and leave unchanged. Hart did not plan to leave at all. He'd chosen a place where independence could not remain an idea. It would either become skill dash or disappear. And in that quiet certainty, with the modern world already loosening its grip behind him, Hart stepped fully into the canyon. The river did not welcome him. The land did not resist him. It simply waited. And waiting here is the first test. Chapter 2, 1932. The moment dependence became visible. Hart did not leave civilization because it was cruel. He left because he saw how fragile it truly was. Before Hell's Canyon, before stone walls and firewood and silence, there was a different landscape. Texas oil country, flat, hot, endlessly loud. In 1932, the Great Depression had already settled into the bones of the nation, not as chaos, but as exhaustion. Factories did not explode, banks did not burn, they simply stopped. Doors locked, windows went dark. The machinery of daily life slowed, then stalled. Sylvan Hart worked the oil fields alongside men whose bodies were strong and whose futures were suddenly thin. The labor was brutal, grease soaked into skin, heat pressed down without mercy, days blurred into one another, each identical to the last. And yet, Hart noticed something stranger than the hardship itself. The men around him were not afraid of work. They were afraid of losing access to paychecks, access to food, access to shelter. Their lives depended entirely on systems that existed far away. Banks, markets, companies they would never meet and could not influence. When those systems failed, the men failed with them, not because they lacked effort, but because they lacked alternatives. Hart watched carefully. Men with families spoke more quietly now. Men who had followed every rule stared at the ground. Men who had done everything right waited for instructions that never came. This was not collapse as spectacle. It was collapse as realization. Hart began to understand something unsettling. Modern life had separated people from the means of their own survival, not maliciously, efficiently. Food arrived from stores. Clothing arrived from factories. Shelter arrived from contracts. Remove any one of these links, and the chain snapped immediately. This dependence had been invisible during prosperity. Now it was undeniable. Hart did not panic. He did not romanticize the past. He did not imagine himself superior. He simply recognized a structural weakness. The system worked until it didn't. And when it stopped, there was nothing beneath it. This was the moment that stayed with him. Not the hunger, not the unemployment, but the helpless waiting. Men standing idle, not because they lacked skill, but because their skills no longer mattered. Hart understood that intelligence alone was insufficient. Education did not equal autonomy. Knowledge did not equal resilience. The oil fields taught him this lesson quietly, through repetition. Every day, he used tools he did not own, worked schedules he did not control, earned money that could disappear overnight. The arrangement was efficient. It was also brittle. Hart began asking a different question than most people around him. Not how do I survive this downturn, but what would happen if I removed myself entirely? Not temporarily, not symbolically, completely. What if survival itself became personal again? What if food came from effort, not purchase? What if shelter came from understanding, not permission? What if work directly sustained life rather than feeding an abstract system? This was not nostalgia. Hart did not long for a simpler past. He wanted a more direct life, one where cause and effect touched, where mistakes were immediate, where success could not be outsourced, where survival belonged to the person doing the living. This idea did not feel heroic. It felt heavy. Choosing independence meant choosing responsibility at a scale most people never encounter. There would be no one to blame, no institution to appeal to, no safety net disguised as convenience. Hart understood this, and still, the alternative felt worse. Remaining inside a structure that demanded dependence in exchange for stability, a stability he had already seen dissolve. So the decision formed slowly, without drama. He would leave the 20th century not by protest, but by construction. Not by rejecting society loudly, but by refusing to rely on it quietly. The canyon waited. He did not yet know how harsh it would be, how much it would take from him before it gave anything back. But the direction was set. As you rest now, letting your thoughts drift, imagine that moment of clarity. Not panic, not anger, just understanding. A man standing in heat and noise, realizing that the greatest risk was not hardship, but dependence, and choosing calmly to step away. Chapter 3. The First Winter, where ideas become consequences. Independence remained an idea until the first winter forced Hart to pay for every assumption he had made. Hell's Canyon does not announce winter. It closes around you. Cold air sinks into the canyon and stays there, trapped between stone walls like water in a basin. Once it arrives, it does not drift away. It accumulates night after night, week after week. Hart arrived too late in the year to prepare properly. He knew this. He underestimated it anyway. Optimism is a subtle luxury. The canyon removes it quickly. His first shelter was practical only on paper, logs stacked roughly, earth packed against the sides. A roof meant to block wind more than cold. It looked convincing in daylight. It failed quietly at night. The temperature dropped without ceremony. 40 below is not dramatic. It is numbing. Movement becomes deliberate. Thought slows. Tools feel heavier. Fire becomes everything. Hart burned through his wood too quickly, then through brush, then through sage, which burns fast and demands constant attention. Sleep arrived in fragments, 40 minutes at a time, interrupted by the need to feed the fire before the cold reclaimed the room. Days blurred. Nights stretched. For 47 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above zero. This is not the part of the story that invites admiration. There is nothing elegant here. Hands cracked and bled. Breath burned. Weight disappeared. Hart considered leaving. Of course he did. Independence is easier to admire than to endure. But something else was happening beneath the discomfort. The canyon was teaching. Every failure became precise. Every mistake arrived with feedback. The shelter leaked heat because of how it was built. The fire failed because of fuel choice. The exhaustion came from design, not bad luck. This clarity was brutal, but honest. Modern life often delays consequences. The canyon does not. Here, cause and effect stand close enough to shake hands. Hart realized that surviving was not about toughness. It was about structure. The mountain men he had read about were not reckless adventurers. They were engineers of daily life. They understood airflow, heat retention, storage, redundancy. Hart had imagined independence as freedom from systems. The winter revealed a deeper truth. Independence requires better systems, not fewer. The cold did not care about intention. It respected design. By late winter, Hart was no longer improvising. He was observing where heat escaped, where snow gathered, how the wind moved. The canyon itself became a blueprint. Spring arrived slowly, almost apologetically. Ice broke along the river. Sunlight lingered longer each day. Movement returned to hands and joints. Hart survived. Not triumphantly, not proudly. He survived informed. The winter did not defeat him. It corrected him. He emerged thinner, slower, and far more serious about the task he had chosen. This was the moment his life shifted. Before winter, independence had been philosophical. After winter, it became technical. No more guesses, no more optimism. From now on, everything would be built to answer a specific question. Will this still work when the canyon decides to test it? As you sink deeper now, letting the rhythm of breath steady, imagine that quiet end to winter. No celebration, no relief, just understanding. A man standing in thawing ground, realizing that survival was not about escape from systems, but mastery of them. And knowing that from this point forward, the canyon would accept nothing less. Chapter 4. Unlearning Romance, Learning Skill. After the first winter, Hart understood that survival was not heroic, it was procedural. Spring did not bring celebration, it brought work. The ground softened, not as invitation, but as opportunity. Snow receded in patches, revealing mistakes the winter had hidden. Gaps in the shelter, inefficient angles, places where heat had bled away without resistance. Hart studied them quietly. He did not blame the cold. He did not blame chance. He blamed design. The stories he had once admired, the mountain men, the lone pioneers, had framed survival as courage and endurance. But standing there with thawing soil under his boots, Hart saw something else entirely. Those men had not survived because they were bold. They survived because they were methodical. Romance faded quickly. Skill remained. Hart began rebuilding his life not as an adventure, but as a system. Everything needed purpose. Everything needed redundancy. Nothing could rely on luck. He took notes, not in journals meant for reflection, but in marks scratched into wood and stone, measurements, angles, observations repeated until they became instinct. Heat rose. Cold sank. Wind searched for gaps. Water always followed gravity. These were not poetic truths. They were mechanical ones. Hart rebuilt his shelter deeper into the hillside, using earth itself as insulation. Stone replaced wood where fire risk mattered. Ventilation was calculated, not guessed. Each decision was slow, deliberate, unimpressive. This was the part no one wrote about. Survival, as it turned out, was a series of small corrections made consistently without applause. Hart's education returned now, not as theory, but as framework. Geometry mattered, physics mattered, history mattered, not as narrative, but as accumulated trial and error passed forward. He began to understand why old designs looked the way they did, why structures repeated themselves across cultures, why certain tools changed little over centuries. Efficiency survives. The canyon reinforced this lesson daily. If something worked, it kept working. If it failed immediately. There was no room for aesthetic preference, no tolerance for unnecessary complexity. Hart learned to value the plain solution, the heavy solution, the boring solution. And with each improvement, something subtle happened. Life became quieter. Not easier, but calmer. Tasks aligned. Energy stopped leaking. Effort began producing predictable results. This was the moment independence shifted again. Before, Hart had sought freedom from dependency. Now he was learning freedom through competence. A poorly built system feels like chaos. A well-built one feels like peace. Days found rhythm. Morning, maintenance. Midday, construction. Evening, observation. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Hart stopped thinking in terms of comfort. He thought in terms of continuity. Would this decision still make sense next winter? Would it still hold when he was older? Would it still work if he were injured? These were not pessimistic questions. They were respectful ones. The canyon did not reward optimism. It rewarded preparation. As you rest now, you're breathing slow and even. Imagine that shift happening quietly. A man no longer trying to prove anything, no longer chasing an image of independence. Instead, building something durable, something repeatable, something that could survive without him being at his strongest every day. This was the real beginning. Not the arrival in the canyon, not the brutal winter, but the moment Hart stopped romanticizing survival and started engineering a life. From here on, nothing would be accidental. And that, finally, made the canyon begin to cooperate. Chapter 5. A House That Understood the Canyon. Hart did not build a house to resist Hell's Canyon. He built one that agreed with it. After the first winter, Hart stopped patching. Patching was temporary. Patching assumed forgiveness. The canyon did not forgive. So he began again. Not from desperation, but from comprehension. He chose a site with care, a slope that caught morning light but surrendered it early in the evening, close enough to water to carry, far enough to escape flooding, sheltered from the worst winds, yet open enough to release heat. This was not intuition, it was accumulated observation. The house would not sit on the land. It would settle into it. Hart cut into the hillside, letting earth become insulation. Stone formed the lower walls, heavy, patient, unmoved by weather. Timber rose above, chosen not for beauty, but for how it aged. Every angle mattered. Cold air sinks. Warm air rises. So the floor stayed low and thick. The ceiling rose just enough to let heat circulate without escaping. There were no straight lines where they did not serve a purpose. Corners trapped warmth. Openings faced away from prevailing winds. The design was simple. That was the achievement. Modern buildings often fight their environment. This one negotiated. Construction was slow. Hart quarried stone by hand, splitting rock along natural fault lines rather than forcing clean breaks. He carried each piece himself, learning its weight, its texture, its limits. There was no schedule. Time here was not something to be managed. It was something to be spent carefully. The house grew gradually, wall by wall, course by course. Mistakes were corrected immediately, not hidden, not rationalized. If a stone shifted, it was reset. If a beam twisted, it was replaced. The work was repetitive, almost meditative. Lift, place, check, adjust, day after day. There was no sense of progress in the way modern life measures it. No milestones, no deadlines, only the quiet satisfaction of something becoming stable. As the structure took shape, Hart noticed a change. Nights became quieter, not because the canyon softened, but because the house filtered its extremes. Cold no longer crept inward unchecked. Heat no longer lingered unnecessarily. Inside, the air stayed still, predictable. This predictability was a form of peace. For the first time, Hart could rest without vigilance. Sleep deepened, energy returned, work improved. The house did more than shelter him. It allowed his mind to settle. When survival stops demanding constant attention, something else emerges. Planning, reflection, precision. This was not comfort as luxury. It was comfort as capacity. The house did not make life easy. It made life possible without exhaustion. And in that stability, Hart could begin the next phase of his work. Not merely surviving, but refining. The canyon remained indifferent, but the relationship had shifted. Hart was no longer reacting. He was anticipating. As you drift now, you're breathing slow and even. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of that moment. A roof that holds. Walls that stay warm. Silence that no longer threatens. Not because the world became gentler, but because a man learned how to meet it on its own terms. This house was not an ending. It was a foundation. And everything that followed would be built upon it. Chapter 6, The Forge, where thought becomes tool. Once the house allowed him to rest, Hart built the forge, the place where thinking could finally turn into permanence. A house protects the body. A forge protects the future. Hart understood this instinctively. Without tools, every task remained heavy. Without tools, mistakes repeated. Without tools, effort leaked away. So after the house settled into the hillside, after the nights grew quieter and sleep returned, Hart turned his attention to fire. Not the fire that warms, the fire that transforms. The forge was built from stone gathered nearby, mortared with clay he tested again and again until it held heat without cracking. The hearth sat low, sheltered from wind. A chimney rose carefully, angled to draw smoke upward without pulling heat away too quickly. Air mattered as much as flame. Hart constructed bellows from wood and deer hide, stitched patiently with sinew. Each pull delivered breath to the fire. Each release allowed it to settle. Fire, he learned, responds best to rhythm. Too much air, and the metal burned. Too little, and it sulked. The forge did not tolerate distraction. This was not labor, it was conversation. Steel softened slowly, glowing from dull red to orange to something brighter, almost alive. Hart watched closely. Color told him more than temperature ever could. Books had described this process. Experience corrected them. The first tools were rough. They were supposed to be. A crude hammer shapes a better hammer. A better hammer shapes precision. Hart worked without hurry. Heat, strike, turn. Strike again. Each blow carried intention. Each pause mattered. Time disappeared in the forge. Hours passed without friction. Days lost their edges. This was not productivity in the modern sense. Nothing was optimized. Nothing was measured by output. And yet, progress was undeniable. With each tool, something subtle shifted. Tasks grew easier, movements grew smaller. Waste diminished. The forge reduced effort not by speed, but by accuracy. Hart forged chisels that held an edge, knives balanced for control, not aggression, files that cut cleanly without tearing metal. Handles were shaped to hands that would use them every day. No decoration, no flourish, only fit. Tools became extensions of thought. This was the moment his independence deepened. Before, survival had depended on strength and endurance. Now, it depended on precision. A well-made tool does not demand attention. It cooperates. The forge taught Hart something the canyon had only hinted at. Civilization does not begin with shelter. It begins with tools that allow improvement. Each tool carried memory. Not symbolic memory, but functional memory. Lessons embedded in steel, adjustments captured permanently. The forge became a place of quiet authority. Mistakes were allowed, but only once. Metal remembers. If a blade warped, it told you why. If a joint failed, it revealed where. Nothing could be hidden. The forge made honesty unavoidable. And in that honesty, Hart found calm. As you settle deeper now, imagine standing near that fire, the steady breath of bellows, the soft ring of steel meeting steel, the glow fading as metal cools. This is not noise, it is rhythm. The forge does not rush, it does not impress, it simply turns thought into object, and object into continuity. With the forge complete, Hart no longer relied on what he had brought with him. From here forward, he could build what he needed, and that changed everything. Chapter 7. Making tools to make tools. The forge gave Hart tools, but mastery began when he started making tools that could improve themselves. At first, the forge solved immediate problems. A sharper blade meant less effort. A balanced hammer meant fewer mistakes. A proper chisel meant cleaner joints. But Hart did not stop there. He noticed something subtle, something most people overlook. The best tool was not the one that finished a task. It was the one that made the next task easier. So he began building tools whose only purpose was to improve other tools. Files came first. Not store-bought files, those were gone long ago, but carefully cut steel with teeth set at angles learned through trial. He hardened them slowly, quenched them cautiously, tested them against scrap metal until the bite felt right. A good file does not rush. It removes exactly what should not remain. With better files came better edges. With better edges came cleaner work. Then came measuring tools. Squares fashioned from steel and wood, checked repeatedly against themselves. Straight edges trued by light and patience. Simple gauges that told him when something was close enough and when it was not. Precision crept in quietly. Tasks that once required correction now finished cleanly. Time saved itself. Hart realized he was no longer surviving day to day. He was compounding effort. Each improvement stacked on the last. Each tool remembered lessons so his hands didn't have to relearn them. This is how systems grow, and not suddenly, not dramatically, but through small advantages that refuse to disappear. The canyon noticed the change. Work that once exhausted him now felt contained. Movements shortened, errors thinned. Nothing became easy, but nothing was wasted. Hart began to understand why civilizations had always valued craftsmen, not for artistry, but for memory. Tools carried memory forward. They preserved decisions. They stabilized knowledge. A well-made tool did not argue. It repeated the right answer every time. This was independence in its mature form. Not isolation, not self-denial, but the ability to rely on what you had already built. Hart organized his tools carefully, not by category but by sequence. What tool led to the next? What motion preceded another? This was not obsession. It was economy. He worked less by working smarter, not because he sought efficiency, but because efficiency reduced risk. Fatigue causes mistakes. Mistakes invite the canyon. By now, the forge was no longer a project. It was infrastructure. The clang of metal softened into something steady, almost soothing. Fire no longer demanded constant attention. It responded predictably. The bellows breathed when asked. The steel yielded when ready. This predictability changed Hart's relationship with time. He stopped measuring days by how much he endured. He measured them by how much he refined. Evenings grew longer. After work, he cleaned tools carefully, restoring edges, checking alignment. Maintenance became ritual, a way to close the day. Nothing was put away dull. Nothing was left unfinished. The forge had taught him something the house could not. Shelter protects you from the environment. Tools allow you to shape it. And shaping, even on a small scale, creates confidence. Not arrogance, not control. Confidence born of familiarity. Hart no longer wondered whether he could adapt. He knew he could. As you drift deeper now, your breathing slow and even, imagine the quiet order of that workspace. Tools hanging where hands expect them, edges clean, surfaces true, no excess, no shortage. This is not progress as the world defines it. It is stability. And in that stability, Hart crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer reacting to Hell's Canyon. He was working with it. From here on, life would grow not by force, but by accumulation. Small gains, never surrendered. The kind of progress that lasts. Chapter 8. A garden carved from stone. True independence arrived when Hart stopped taking from the land and began shaping time itself. Metal had given Hart leverage. The forge had given him memory. But food was different. Food could not be rushed. It did not respond to precision alone. It demanded patience, measured in seasons. The ground around Hell's Canyon was not welcoming. Rock pressed close to the surface. Soil thin and acidic. Water ran downhill without apology. Plants did not volunteer here. Hart began by watching. Where snow melted first, where moisture lingered, where the sun touched longest before slipping behind stone walls. He chose a slope that caught morning light and surrendered it early, protecting tender growth from afternoon heat. Then he began moving stone, not clearing it away, arranging it. Terraces took shape slowly, each wall stacked by hand. Stones were chosen for weight and fit, not appearance. Gravity was not fought, it was recruited. The work was heavy but predictable. Lift, set, test. Once the walls held, Hart carried soil from the riverbank, richer earth mixed with decomposed leaves and fish remains, each load small enough to manage alone. Hundreds of trips, thousands. The garden did not appear all at once, and it emerged. Water came next. A spring higher up the canyon offered possibility. Hart traced its flow, measured its consistency through the seasons. When he committed, he dug channels by hand, lining them with stone and wood to slow erosion. Water does not need force. It needs guidance. The channels carried moisture gently. No pumps, no pressure, only gravity and patience. The first plantings were conservative. Potatoes, forgiving and reliable. Beans, climbing and generous. Squash, sprawling and resilient. Failures were expected. Seeds that did not sprout were noted, not mourned. Those that thrived were marked carefully. Hart saved seeds from the strongest plants, year after year. Without intending to, he began selecting for the canyon itself. Plants adapted, leaves thickened, roots deepened. Growth slowed, but strengthened. The garden taught Hart a new rhythm. Metal responded within hours. Stone within days. Plants answered in months. This forced a different relationship with time. There was no sense of completion here, only continuation. Work in the garden was quiet, unremarkable, No dramatic harvests, no abundance worth boasting. But reliability returned something more valuable: confidence. Hart no longer wondered if food would come, he planned for it. Winter storage followed. Root cellars dug into the hillside, stone-lined, earth-insulated, potatoes layered with straw. Beans dried and sealed. Squash stored where air circulated but frost could not reach. Food became inventory, not hoarded but accounted for. Each meal now carried history, not nostalgia, data. Hart knew exactly how much effort had gone into each bite, how many hours of lifting, how many weeks of waiting. Waste became unthinkable, not out of virtue, but logic. The garden did not make life easier. It made life predictable. And predictability in Hell's Canyon was freedom. As you rest now, breathing slow and even, imagine that hillside garden, stone walls warming in early light, leaves barely moving in the still air, water flowing quietly where it is meant to go. This is not farming as industry. It is farming as conversation. Hart no longer imposed his will on the land. He listened, adjusted. In return, the land offered continuity. The forge had taught him mastery of objects. The garden taught him mastery of time. And with that, his independence became complete. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and capable of lasting. Chapter 9. The Quiet Mathematics of Survival. Once food was secured, Hart began refining the invisible systems that made survival repeatable. The garden solved hunger. It did not solve continuity. That came next. Hart understood something most people never need to learn. Survival is not about one good season. It is about whether the next one arrives prepared. He began counting. Not days, not years, resources. Firewood was stacked by weight, not appearance. Hardwoods separated from soft. Pieces sized for different uses. Quick heat, long burn, overnight endurance. Each pile represented hours of future warmth already earned. Tools were inventoried mentally, not by number but by role. One axe for felling, one for splitting, a lighter blade for shaping. Redundancy mattered. Failure could not be outsourced. When a handle loosened, it was fixed immediately. When steel dulled, it was sharpened before necessity forced the issue. Delay was danger, disguised as rest. Hart's days fell into patterns but never routines. Routine assumes predictability. Patterns respond to conditions. Morning always began with assessment. Weather, water, fire. Only then came action. Some days the forge remained cold. Some days the garden waited untouched. Work followed priority, not habit. Fishing became seasonal arithmetic. Spring runs were generous, fall less so. Hart smoked fish slowly, using alderwood for consistency. Each batch was tested, tasted, adjusted. Fat was rendered into oil stored in clay vessels sealed with wax. Nothing existed for a single purpose. Oil-fueled lamps. Lamp soot became pigment. Ash enriched soil. Every output became input elsewhere. The system closed on itself, and hunting followed restraint. Heart took what was needed, not what was available. Deer hides were more valuable than meat alone. Tendons became thread, bones became tools, fat became fuel. The animal did not disappear. It transformed. Storage demanded discipline. Food was rotated, not merely stored. Oldest first, weakest inspected. Mold addressed before spread. Loss accepted without panic but noted. Mistakes were allowed once, never twice. As you listen now, settling deeper, imagine this quiet accounting. No spreadsheets, no ledgers, just memory reinforced by repetition. Hart did not fear scarcity. He planned around it. Winter sharpened everything. Movement slowed. Errors multiplied. The margin for correction narrowed to 1 inch. During long freezes, Hart rationed not food, but energy. Tasks were chosen carefully. Heavy labor waited for midday warmth. Precision work saved for mornings when hands were steady. Reading filled the dark hours. Books were not escape. They were tools of perspective. Philosophy sharpened patience. History reduced urgency. Hart understood that survival was as much mental as physical. Panic wastes fuel. Isolation was managed deliberately. Hart spoke aloud while working, sang off-key songs in multiple languages. Sound anchored presence. Silence can become pressure if untreated. Visitors later mistook this for eccentricity. It was maintenance. The forge, when lit in winter, became sanctuary. The rhythmic hammering regulated breath. The glow reduced the vastness of cold into manageable space. Heat was produced deliberately, not consumed mindlessly. Even sleep followed strategy. Hart slept early, rose before dawn, and rested when tasks allowed. Fatigue was never ignored. A tired man misjudges weight, misjudges footing. In Hell's Canyon, misjudgment compounds quickly. By now, the systems overlapped seamlessly. Garden-fed body, forge-fed tools. Tools fed shelter. Shelter protected sleep. Sleep preserved judgment. Nothing stood alone. This was not survival as endurance. It was survival as design. As your breathing slows further, picture Hart at rest. Fire banked low, food accounted for, tools aligned. No anxiety, no anticipation, only readiness. And readiness, Hart knew, was the highest form of comfort. He did not wait for problems. He removed their conditions. In doing so, survival stopped feeling urgent. It became ordinary, and ordinary, sustained long enough, became peace. In the next stretch of his life, that peace would be tested, not by nature, but by people. But for now, in this moment, everything holds. The canyon sleeps. And so does the man who learned how to make it predictable. Chapter 10. When the world remembered him. True solitude ended not when Hart grew tired of it, but when the world finally noticed he was still there. For years, nothing changed. Seasons repeated. Systems held. Hart aged quietly without ceremony. Strength adjusted. Movements slowed but did not weaken. He learned to let gravity work more, muscle less. Efficiency replaced force. The canyon accepted him as a constant. Then movement appeared on the river. At first it was rare. A boat drifting past too slowly. A voice calling out, unsure. Hart would step onto the bank, curious but calm. He did not hide. He waved. Visitors expected something feral. They found something composed. The buckskin clothing was immaculate. The tools arranged with care. The lodge stood solid, deliberate, unmistakably permanent. Conversation came easily. Hart spoke without performance. He answered questions directly, explained processes patiently. He did not defend his choices. He did not need to. People returned to the river changed. They told stories. A man living alone, a man who made his own guns, a man who refused modern life and seemed content. Curiosity traveled faster than water. More boats appeared, then riders. Hart did not seek them. He did not avoid them. He treated attention the same way he treated weather, observed, adjusted, continued. Journalists arrived expecting spectacle. They found discipline. What unsettled them was not the isolation. It was the competence. Nothing here was symbolic, nothing decorative. Every object justified its existence. Visitors lingered longer than intended. Tea slowed conversation. Demonstrations replaced questions. Hart showed how barrels were bored, how hides were softened, how water was guided. He did not dramatize difficulty. Difficulty was assumed. What impressed people most was not what he had built, but how little he complained about building it. The story traveled outward, newspapers, magazines. A man who walked away from collapse, a man who built a life with his hands. Hart became a mirror. Some saw rebellion. Some saw insanity. Others saw a question they had been avoiding. Why do we live the way we do? Hart did not answer publicly. He simply lived. As attention increased, so did tension. Land boundaries became topics of discussion. Maps appeared where none had mattered before. Officials began to ask questions Hart had never needed to answer. Ownership, they said. Jurisdiction. Hart listened politely. He had expected this eventually. Nothing permanent escapes notice forever. The canyon had protected him from distance, not authority. When officials arrived by boat, Hart greeted them as guests, offered tea, gave tours, explained his systems. He did not apologize for them. They saw no chaos, no damage. They saw stewardship. But systems do not recognize stewardship easily. They recognize categories: private, public, permitted, removed. Hart refused removal quietly. When asked where he would go, he answered honestly, nowhere. He had built not a shelter, but an argument. Stone by stone, tool by tool. When pressure increased, Hart did not escalate. He clarified. If removed, everything here would be lost. The knowledge embedded in placement, orientation, soil, and flow would vanish. He was not threatening. He was explaining consequences. And then, when explanations failed, he prepared. Not theatrically, practically, stone towers rose, narrow openings aligned with approach paths, not aggression, deterrence, a statement without words. Some called it madness. Others recognized it as consistency. Hart defended what he built the same way he had built it, deliberately. The confrontation never reached violence. Recognition arrived instead. Exceptions were made. Rules bent around reality. Hart remained. As you drift deeper now, imagine this moment. The river carrying sound away. Stone holding its shape. A man standing in place, not defiant but immovable. The world had remembered him and found that he could not be easily erased. In the next part, we will watch what happens when solitude becomes legacy, and how a life designed for one becomes a question for many. For now, rest with this thought. True independence does not shout. It stands and waits and remains. Chapter 11. What remains after the work is done. A life built for solitude does not end in silence. It leaves behind a question. After the visitors slowed, after the officials stopped returning, after the river learned his outline again, Hart's days returned to their earlier shape. Not unchanged, just quieter. The systems held. The garden still grew. The forge still answered heat. The walls still kept their promise. What changed was not the work, but the awareness that it would not last forever. Hart felt time differently now. Not as urgency, as narrowing, he adjusted accordingly. Projects became smaller, more precise. He repaired instead of expanding, replaced only what could not be maintained. Stone walls were checked, not extended. Tools were refined, not multiplied. Perfection mattered less than continuity. He wrote more. Notes appeared on scraps of paper, margins of books, charcoal marks on wood. Observations about soil, about water flow, about weather patterns that only decades could reveal. Not instructions, reminders. Hart did not expect anyone to continue his life, but he refused to let knowledge evaporate. The river still brought visitors, not crowds, pilgrims. They walked more slowly now, asked fewer questions, looked longer. Hart noticed the shift. People no longer came to see a curiosity. They came to measure themselves. Some stayed quiet the entire visit. Others talked too much, trying to justify lives they had not yet examined. Hart listened to both. He had learned long ago that answers are rarely wanted. Confirmation is. He offered neither. When asked if he regretted anything, Hart paused longer than usual, then answered simply, "Number." Not because the life had been easy, because it had been chosen. That distinction mattered. Ease could not replace ownership. The canyon aged with him. Trees shifted, paths softened. He adapted his movements, used leverage more, let tasks stretch across days instead of forcing completion. Winter mornings became slower. He accepted that. Cold did not frighten him. It instructed. In the long evenings, Hart sat more often without reading, without tools, just listening to the river. He had learned everything it had to teach. Peace arrived quietly. Not satisfaction, alignment. The work and the man no longer argued. When sleep came, it was unforced. Hart did not fear the end. He had lived with consequence for too long to imagine otherwise. When death finally arrived, it did not announce itself. It behaved like winter, gradual, inevitable, uninterested in drama. Hart lay down in the place he had built, surrounded by objects that carried his shape, tools worn to his grip, stone warmed by decades of use. No witnesses, only completion. The river continued. Spring returned. Visitors noticed the absence before they understood it. No figure on the bank, no wave, just stillness. What followed was not mourning, but sorting. The place could not be abandoned. It could not be replicated. Eventually, caretakers arrived. They preserved without modernizing, stabilized without altering. The garden was planted again. Seeds selected long ago still responded. Hart had outlived himself in soil. Today the site remains, not as a monument, as evidence. Evidence that a single human life, arranged deliberately, can form a complete system. That independence is not noise or defiance, but coherence. As you rest now, breathing slow and even, consider what lingers from a life. Not possessions, not recognition, patterns, habits, repeated long enough to shape a place. Hart did not leave answers. He left a demonstration. That is why his story endures, not because it demands imitation, but because it invites examination. What would remain if your routines disappeared? What systems would hold? What would continue without explanation? These are not questions for tonight. They are questions to sleep with. The canyon holds its shape. The river keeps moving. And somewhere in that quiet persistence, a life built carefully enough becomes difficult to forget. Rest now. The work for tonight is done. Chapter 12. The question that follows you home. The true legacy of Hart's life is not what he built, but what it quietly asks of those who hear his story. Long after the river bends away from 5 Mile Bar, long after the stone walls fade into memory, something remains unsettled. Not the image of a man in buckskin, not the guns, or the forge, or the garden cut from stone. The question remains. People leave the canyon changed in small ways. They notice silence more sharply. They feel time stretch instead of snap. Some return to cities, to schedules and screens, and feel, briefly, that something essential has gone missing. Not comfort, not convenience. Agency. Hart does not accuse. His life does not condemn. It simply contrasts. Modern life excels at removing friction. It smooths edges, automates decisions, distributes responsibility until no single person carries the weight of survival. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Hart carried weight deliberately. Every choice mattered because every choice had consequence. Food was grown or not, firewood cut or not, tools maintained or not. Nothing was abstract. And because nothing was abstract, nothing felt meaningless. That is the part people struggle to name. They do not envy the labor, they envy the clarity. In Hart's life, effort and outcome were visibly connected. Work led somewhere tangible. Time invested returned as warmth, nourishment, shelter. In modern life, effort often dissolves into systems too large to feel. Emails answered. Numbers adjusted, targets met, and yet something feels unresolved. Hart did not escape difficulty. He escaped ambiguity. As you lie still now, letting the story settle, consider how rarely we feel the full arc of our own actions. How often our days end without evidence. Hart ended each day surrounded by proof. Proof that he had moved matter, that he had shaped time. This does not mean his life was superior. It was narrower, and within that narrowness, it was whole. The canyon did not give Hart meaning. It removed alternatives. And in the absence of alternatives, commitment deepened. This is uncomfortable to consider because most of us live surrounded by choice. Choice dilutes commitment. Commitment sharpens identity. Hart knew who he was because his options were few. We struggle to know who we are because our options never end. This is not a call to abandon society. It is an invitation to notice where friction has been eliminated and what vanished with it. What tasks do you never finish with your hands? What needs do you no longer know how to meet? What skills feel unnecessary only because someone else performs them invisibly? Hart carried his entire life within reach. We carry fragments, outsourced pieces scattered across systems we trust but do not understand. Again, this is not condemnation. It is observation. The kind best made quietly. Hart never urged visitors to follow him. He warned them instead, this life is harder than it looks. Most people would not want it, and he was right. But that was never the point. The point was possibility. That another configuration existed. That one person could choose differently and remain intact. As you drift deeper now, the edges of thought softening, notice how this story does not ask for action. It asks for honesty. What do you depend on? What could you rebuild if you had to? What would you miss, not emotionally, but practically, if systems paused tomorrow? These are not fears. They are measurements. Hart measured himself against necessity. We measure ourselves against expectation. Neither is inherently better, but one is quieter. And quiet, tonight, is enough. The canyon sleeps. The river keeps its slow, unbroken conversation with stone. Hart is no longer there. But the question is, and it does not hurry you for an answer. It is content to wait, just like the land, just like time. Rest now. Carry the question lightly. There is no urgency, only awareness, and that for tonight is enough. Chapter 13. Learning to live with enough. Hart's final lesson was not how to survive alone, but how little a complete life actually requires. After the question settles, another feeling follows. not urgency, not guilt. Relief, because the story does not demand transformation. It does not insist that you change your life, sell your belongings, or retreat into wilderness. It simply reframes scale. Hart lived with very little by modern standards, and yet his days were full. Not busy, full. Each object around him had earned its place. Nothing existed merely to distract. Nothing waited for a replacement. When something broke, it did not create inconvenience. It created purpose. Purpose is rare now. Most of our days are designed to avoid it. We scroll instead of repair, replace instead of understand. Again, not wrong, just revealing. Hart repaired because he had to, and in doing so, he learned intimacy with his world. He knew the sound of a blade that needed sharpening, the smell of wood ready for fire, the weight of soil before rain. These are not romantic details. They are signals. Signals that told him what to do next. Modern life gives fewer signals. It gives alerts instead. Hart did not wake to notifications. He woke to conditions, and conditions do not lie. If it was cold, he acted. If food ran low, he adjusted. If tools dulled, he corrected. No ambiguity. The result was not comfort in the modern sense. It was sufficiency. Enough warmth, enough food, enough clarity. Enough is an uncomfortable word today. It implies a stopping point. Hart stopped accumulating early, not because he rejected abundance, but because he defined it differently. Abundance was having what mattered when it mattered, nothing more. As you lie still now, let this idea settle gently. Enough does not mean less joy. It often means less noise. Hart's joy was quiet. A fire holding through the night. A garden returning each spring. A tool working exactly as intended. Small successes repeated until they formed a life. Most people chase peaks. Hart lived on plateaus. And plateaus are where endurance happens. The modern world trains us to optimize, to upgrade, to improve endlessly. Hart optimized once, then maintained. Maintenance is uncelebrated work. It does not trend. It does not impress. But it sustains. This is why his life feels strange to us. It lacks escalation. No promotions, no expansion, just continuation. And continuation, sustained long enough, becomes meaning. When people ask what Hart achieved, the answer is unsatisfying. He did not invent a system. He did not build an empire. He aligned his needs with his abilities. That alignment is rare. Most of us live mismatched lives, needs outsourced, abilities underused. Hart matched them carefully, not perfectly, but honestly. That honesty is what lingers. As the story moves toward its final stretch, notice how the tone changes. There is no climax coming, no final triumph, just steadiness. This is intentional, because the most radical thing Hart did was refuse escalation. He did not seek more. He chose enough. And in choosing enough, he gained peace. Peace that did not depend on external validation. peace that survived weather, age, and attention. Peace built slowly, like stone walls that do not need to be admired to function. Tonight, you do not need to answer the question heart leaves behind. You do not need to simplify your life or complicate it. Just notice where enough might already exist. Notice what you maintain without thinking. Notice what you could repair instead of replace. These thoughts are not instructions. They are invitations. Invitations you can ignore without consequence. Heart would not mind. He did not live to convince. He lived to align. An alignment, once witnessed, cannot be unseen. The river continues. The canyon remains. And somewhere between waking and sleep, the idea of enough settles like a weight you realize you no longer need to carry. Rest now. The story is still moving, but slowly, just like it should. Chapter 14. The Shape of a Finished Day. A life well lived does not rush toward meaning. It settles into it, one ordinary day at a time. Heart's days did not end with accomplishment. They ended with closure. This is subtle but important. Modern days often stop abruptly. An alarm, a screen going dark, a task abandoned for tomorrow. Heart closed his days deliberately. Fire reduced to embers. Tools returned to their hooks. Food accounted for. Nothing waited unresolved. Not because he was obsessive, because unresolved work carries weight into rest. Sleep for heart was not escape. It was recovery. And recovery required completion. As evening settled in Hell's Canyon, light moved predictably across stone walls. Heart noticed this shift without measuring it. The land itself told him when to stop. Dinner was simple, often repetitive. Repetition did not bore him. It reassured. Familiar meals meant the system was holding. After eating, Heart cleaned immediately. Utensils dried. Surfaces cleared. The kitchen reset for morning. Resetting is an underappreciated skill. Most people accumulate fatigue overnight. Heart reduced it. Evenings were not filled with stimulation. No entertainment to consume. No novelty to chase. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he repaired small things. Sometimes he sat in silence. Silence, used correctly, does not feel empty. It feels spacious. The river provided sound. The fire provided movement. That was enough input. As your breathing deepens now, imagine this scene. A single lamp. Soft shadows. The slow pop of wood shifting in heat. This is not loneliness. It is containment. Heart did not need distraction to tolerate his thoughts. His thoughts were shaped by work that made sense. This matters. People fear quiet because their days feel unfinished. Heart finished his. Even when tasks remained for tomorrow, they were cued. He knew what would come next. Uncertainty did not leak into rest. This is the gift of systems. They free the mind. As Heart aged, his evenings lengthened. Not because he worked less, but because he paused more often. Pauses are not idleness. They are calibration. He sat longer, watching flames settle, listening to water in the dark. he reflected without nostalgia. No wishing for youth, no regret for effort. His life had coherence. That coherence acted as insulation against anxiety. You do not lie awake questioning a life that aligns. This is why Hart slept deeply. Not long, but fully. Each night reset him. Each morning welcomed him back. Days did not blur. They stacked. One complete unit at a time. The modern world fragments days. Meetings interrupt meals. Messages interrupt focus. Sleep interrupts exhaustion instead of concluding effort. Hart reversed this. Effort concluded sleep. This is not a lesson to replicate. It is an observation to notice. How often do your days end unfinished? How often do you carry unresolved loops into rest? These questions are not demands. They are mirrors. As the story continues toward its final stretch, the pace slows intentionally, because endings deserve space. Hart did not rush his life. He did not rush its ending. He allowed days to complete themselves. And in doing so, he built something rare, a life that felt done each night. Not over, just finished for now. This is why his story does not burn bright and disappear. It glows steadily, like embers that remain warm long after flames are gone. Rest now. Let your own day find its shape. You do not need to solve anything tonight. Just allow the weight to settle. Completion is closer than you think. Chapter 15. When strength learns to yield. The final test of self-reliance is not how much you can do, but how gracefully you adjust when you can do less. Age arrived without announcement, not as collapse, as resistance. Hart noticed it first in small places, the way cold lingered longer in his joints, the way heavy stones asked for rest between lifts, the way mornings required an extra moment before motion felt honest. He did not resent this. Resentment wastes energy. Instead, he adjusted. Tools were repositioned closer to work areas. Tasks were divided across days rather than forced into hours. He let leverage replace strength. Gravity replaced force. Experience replaced urgency. This was not decline, it was refinement. Hart understood something many people never face directly. Strength has phases. What matters is not clinging to the first one, but learning the next. He stopped lifting what could be rolled, stopped carrying what could be slid, stopped bending where kneeling worked better. The land taught him this long ago. Water does not fight rock. It finds a path around it. Hart became water. Winter demanded more caution now. He cut firewood earlier in the season, stacked more than needed. Redundancy became comfort. Comfort in this phase of life was not indulgence. It was foresight. He listened to his body the way he once listened to weather. Subtle signals mattered. Fatigue was information. Pain was instruction. He did not push through warning signs. He redesigned around them. As you rest now, breathing slow and steady, imagine this shift. Not a man fading, a system adapting. Hart's days grew quieter but not emptier. He spent more time observing, less time producing. Observation had become its own form of work. He noticed how shadows changed through the seasons, how animals adjusted their paths, how the river spoke differently in low water than in flood. These observations were not idle, they completed the circle. When your life depends on systems you built yourself, understanding their long-term behavior matters. Hart was no longer building. He was stewarding. Stewardship requires humility. You accept that things will continue without you and plan accordingly. Hart began labeling tools more clearly, leaving notes not for instruction but for orientation, where things belonged, why certain choices had been made, not explanations. Context. He was not preparing successors. He was honoring coherence. Meals became simpler, less variety, more reliability. He favored foods that required minimal effort to prepare and digest. Efficiency extended inward. Sleep changed, too. He slept longer, not deeper. Naps became part of the day, not a failure of discipline. Rest was now strategic. Hart had nothing to prove. That freedom is rare. Most people exhaust themselves, performing youth long after it stops serving them. Hart let go. Letting go did not reduce him. It clarified him. His presence became steadier, words fewer. When he spoke, visitors listened more carefully. He had outgrown explanation. Questions came less often now. People sensed something different. They did not come to be impressed. They came to be reassured. Hart reassured them without intent, by existing, by showing that a life built deliberately does not collapse when strength fades. It reorganizes. The systems held. The garden still produced. The walls still stood. The fire still warmed. Hart trusted them. Trust is the final product of good design. As the evening hours lengthened, he spent more time simply watching the fire settle. He no longer felt compelled to use every moment. Time had softened. There was no race left to win, only balance to maintain. This stage of his life was quieter than the beginning. But it was not smaller. It was distilled. Everything unnecessary had already been removed. What remained was essential. As you drift deeper now, let this settle gently. Strength is not lost when it changes form. It matures, and maturity, when allowed, is its own kind of power. Rest now. The night continues, and the story moves toward its final calm. Chapter 16. Making Peace with the Ending. A life built with intention does not fear its ending. It prepares space for it. At some point, Hart stopped measuring the future, not because he lost interest, because he had learned its shape. Days still arrived. Seasons still turned. But planning shifted from expansion to readiness. He no longer asked what could be added. He asked what needed to remain stable. This is a quiet transition. Most people never experience it clearly. They stay busy enough to avoid noticing the horizon. Hart noticed it without alarm. The body spoke more plainly now. Breath shortened after effort. Recovery took longer. Hart listened. Listening had always been his strength. He rearranged his life again, not dramatically but carefully. Tasks were simplified, paths cleared and re-cleared, so footing remained safe even when attention slipped. He reduced risk. Not out of fear, out of respect. Living alone meant no margin for denial. He prepared for illness the same way he prepared for winter. Extra firewood, extra food preserved, water routes checked twice. Preparedness is not pessimism. It is kindness toward the future. Hart knew there might be days when he could not do what he had always done. He designed for that possibility. Tools were kept sharper, stores slightly fuller. He accepted that some problems might arrive without solutions. Acceptance did not frighten him. It steadied him. Evenings grew longer now, not because the sun changed, but because Hart rested earlier. He sat more often without purpose, watched flames, watched shadows move across familiar stone. He did not rush to fill time. Time no longer needed filling. As you lie quietly now, notice how the story feels different here. There is no tension left. No challenge waiting. Just presence. Hart's thoughts turned inward, but not regretfully. He reviewed his life the way one reviews a well-built structure, noticing where it held, noting where repairs had been clever. He remembered the first winter, the cold that almost took him, the lessons it forced. He remembered the first successful harvest, the first rifle barrel bored clean and straight. He remembered visitors, faces blurring together, but reactions clear. The awe, the disbelief, the quiet envy. None of it mattered more than the work itself. What mattered was coherence. His life made sense to him. That is rare. People often fear death because they fear unfinished stories. Hart's story was finished every day. When illness came, and it did, it arrived without ceremony. Weakness replaced strength gradually. Hart adjusted again. He worked less, rested more. He did not dramatize the change. Drama wastes energy. He prepared his space carefully, ensured everything was in order, not obsessively, just clearly. Tools clean, food stored, firewood ready. This was not preparation for survival. It was preparation for peace. Hart did not leave instructions for how to live. He left conditions for continuity. When he lay down to rest more often than work, the canyon remained unchanged. The river still moved. The stars still turned. Nothing paused for him. And that felt right. He had never asked the world to wait. As the end approached, Hart felt no urgency to speak. No final message burned inside him. The work had already said everything. He had demonstrated what mattered. Words would add little. The last nights were quiet. The fire burned low. Hart slept and woke in gentle intervals. Awareness faded and returned like tides. There was no struggle, just release. When death arrived, it did not feel like interruption. It felt like completion. Hart died where he had lived, inside a system that held, even without him. The river continued, the walls stood, the garden waited. As you rest now, drifting deeper towards sleep, allow this ending to soften you, not as loss, as resolution. A life fully lived does not need a dramatic ending. It simply stops, and in stopping, leaves behind stillness. The next part will carry us gently beyond the man himself, to what remains when presence becomes memory. For now, rest. The night is deep, and everything that needed doing has been done. Chapter 17. When Presence Becomes Landscape. After a life ends, what remains is not absence, but a pattern the world continues to follow. When Hart was gone, the canyon did not react. The river did not slow. The wind did not pause. Morning arrived on schedule, light touching stone exactly where it always had. Birds moved through familiar routes. The world continued without ceremony. And yet, something had changed. The change was not dramatic. It was spatial. Absence took shape. Visitors felt it before they named it. A porch without movement, a door that stayed closed longer than usual, smoke that no longer rose at predictable hours. Nothing was broken, nothing abandoned, just quiet. Those who knew the rhythms noticed first. Guides slowed their boats. Rangers lingered longer on the bank. They did not rush into the space. They listened. Hart's presence had been woven into the environment so thoroughly that its removal left contours, like a hand withdrawn from water. The place held memory without storytelling. Stone walls retained warmth from fires long banked. Paths remained worn in deliberate lines. Tools rested exactly where hands expected them to be. The system still worked. This surprised people. They expected decay. They found stability. The garden sprouted when spring arrived. Seeds selected decades earlier responded to light and soil as they always had. The irrigation channels guided water gently, without adjustment. The land had learned the design. This is the difference between influence and imprint. Hart had not dominated the canyon. He had taught it a rhythm. Caretakers arrived later, carefully. They resisted improvement, resisted efficiency. They preserved instead. Preservation is restraint. They maintained stone walls without straightening them, cleaned tools without polishing away wear, planted the garden without altering its scale. They understood something essential. This place did not belong to the present. It belonged to continuity. As years passed, the story traveled farther than the river. People came not for spectacle, but calibration. They walked through the space quietly, touching stone, noting the simplicity. They asked fewer questions. They did not need answers. The place explained itself. It explained what happens when a life is aligned tightly enough to shape surroundings. When effort is repeated long enough to become infrastructure, when choices settle into habit and habit settles into land. Hart was no longer present, but his decisions were. As you lie still now, letting the final minutes drift by, imagine walking through that place alone. No narration, no plaques, just space arranged for use. A bench placed where the sun rests longest in winter. A door hinged to block wind. A shelf at the height of a familiar reach. This is how presence persists. Not as memory, as utility. Modern culture remembers through images, through records, through stories repeated until they flatten. Hart remained through function. That is harder to erase. People who visited did not leave. Inspired? They left oriented. Their own lives felt louder by comparison, more crowded, more complicated than necessary. Some changed nothing. Some changed one small thing. They repaired something instead of replacing it. Learned one skill instead of buying convenience, finished a day more deliberately. Hart did not ask for this. He did not offer guidance. He simply demonstrated that coherence could exist. That demonstration was enough. Eventually, time softened the edges, wood weathered, stone shifted slightly. No one rushed to correct it. Aging was part of the design. Hart had allowed his own body to age without resistance. The place followed suit. This is what made it feel alive, not frozen in ideal form. Responsive. As the final moments of this journey approach, there is no conclusion to draw, no lesson to underline, only a quiet understanding. A human life, arranged carefully, can become part of a place. And when that happens, death does not erase it. It redistributes it. Into soil, into pathways, into habits others unconsciously adopt. The canyon carries Hart now, not as a figure, but as a pattern. The river keeps time, the land remembers, and you, listening at the edge of sleep, carry a softer version of the same idea, that what you do repeatedly shapes more than your days. It shapes the spaces you move through, the systems you leave behind. And sometimes that is enough. Rest now. The story has reached its stillness. The night holds, and everything that mattered is already in place.